Good morning. So today's lesson is going to be a follow-up to information that you read last class period on leads and endings. So hopefully you got some good advice from the William Zinsser piece. And I think that he does a really good job of explaining how to make the beginning of an essay or any piece of writing interesting and how to make the conclusion interesting. So some of my favorite things that he says are trying to keep away from doing the same thing that everyone else is doing. I usually make the joke in class that students will start papers by saying, since the dawn of mankind, people have been, and then like insert topic there. And so there are just certain things that you see again and again that have become kind of cliched. And he gives examples from things that he's read. And then one of my favorite things that he says about the conclusion of a piece is that when it's time to stop or start or look for the nearest exit. And I think that is important. I think for me, the most important thing for you to be thinking about in your introduction and conclusion is that you should have concrete information in both of those. So usually when introductions and conclusions are not interesting is when there's no new information. And I know that like in a conclusion, obviously you don't want to bring up some entirely new point, but you do want to provide the reader with some element of newness or surprise. That could be by using a quotation. It could be by looping back to a story that maybe you started in the introduction, but you need actual concrete information. You can't just say a bunch of general statements and expect that to kind of be enough. So that advice I think is very good. So you probably wrote down some other things. The second question here, what is the actual work that an introduction needs to do or that a conclusion needs to do? And I think that an introduction essentially needs to get the reader's attention, establish the problem or issue or topic, and then lead us to a thesis. And I think a conclusion, basically, you don't need to repeat the thesis. You don't need to repeat the thesis in other words. You don't have to sum up or summarize the things that you've already said. But I think that the conclusion needs to feel like the end. I know that is a little vague, but that's what William Zinsser says, it needs to feel like the end. And I think that you can do that by using a quotation that kind of sums up a point that you're trying to make. You can predict the consequences. You can explain the so what in the conclusion. Those are all strategies that you can use in your conclusion. Also, I hope that you looked over those multiple choice questions that were on AP Classroom. So those questions are similar to questions that you might see on the AP exam. These are probably actually easier than questions you'll see on the AP exam. So the questions will get progressively more difficult as we move through the units and you learn additional skills. So today's lesson, we are going to actually continue with the leads and endings work that we did last class, and we're going to listen to the first episode of a podcast. So if you go to Google Classroom and you look in Unit 2, so if you go to classwork, you'll see that I've created a new unit for In Cold Blood, and you'll see Lesson 2 materials, and there you'll find the link to the podcast episode. You'll also see a link to the podcast transcript, and additionally 2 slides that I want you to copy and paste into your skills notebook, where you are going to do a little bit of analysis of the first episode. So this is what those handouts will look like. So there's one that kind of just asks you some questions that I think some of them really do tag on to what we've already been doing pretty well. And then on the second slide, I'm asking you to do some timeline analysis as far as how she orders the events. You might need more boxes than this. You might need fewer. Feel free to delete or add as you see fit. And if you need to create like another slide to continue with your notes on timeline. But the things that I want you to talk about are in these instructions that are at the top. So don't forget that next class is going to be our quiz and discussion over In Cold Blood. I am asking that everyone, if at all possible, Zoom in on that day for our class discussion. So I think I've figured out some ways that we can discuss as a whole class, even with those of you who are virtual. So be prepared for that for next class, and let me know if you have any questions.